Hello, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Good evening. Namaste. Sat Sri Akal from Lahore. Welcome to the fourth session of Sunday Stories Live. I'm excited, honored, humbled, and slightly nervous for to be hosting, especially today's conversation. And we will soon find out why. My name is Furrukh Khan, and I'll be your MC for this conversation today. It's my pleasure to welcome, people who have switched on to hear or to see this particular interaction from all over the world. And it's my honor to be conversing with a multi-talented and truly gifted scholar today that we have is Miss Anjali Enjeti. And just a little bit about myself. I've been teaching partition at a course on partition, and I did my PhD on partition long time ago. But I've been teaching it at LAMS Lahore for over 20 years, and in that one has had to kind of learn. No matter how much time one has spent doing this, there are always opportunity to learn new things, and that's something that I'm kind of continuously doing. My own connection with partition is that my mother's side comes from a place near Gurdaspur, Kalupur, and they moved here in 1947. I've been involved with 1947 partition archive for the last few years, and they have been doing a tremendous job. I think tremendous would be a cliche term to use in terms of capturing what is otherwise lost history, not just of people, but of a community, of ourselves, of a region. So their flagship oral history project is one of the largest in South Asia, and so far have documented over 10,000 families' stories. So you can learn more about this by visiting the website, the archives website, or by speaking one of the number of team members who are here. So as I said, it is my honor to speak with Miss Anjali Enjeti. This is the thing. That's why I'm nervous. So, but let's welcome her. And Anjali is a former attorney, so that's why one has to be very careful on how one speaks with her. So she's an organizer, an award-winning journalist based near Atlanta. She's the author of critically acclaimed books, Southbound, Essays on Identity, Inheritance, and Social Change, and the one which is much more pertinent to our discussion today, The Parted Earth, which is about partition, and we will talk about that. Other writings have appeared in Oxford American, in Kirkus, in Harper's, Bazaar, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Boston Globe, Washington Post, and so many other different places. She teaches, and not only that, she still has time to teach creative writing in the MFA program at Reinhardt University, and and you can find out more about this wonderfully talented guest that we have at anjalienjeti.com. So thank you. The big applause. I'm very happy to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you for such a wonderful and enthusiastic introduction, Furrukh. I don't think anyone has brought me in such an illustrious manner. It is such an honor to be in conversation with you and to be a part of this incredible organization's Sunday Stories event. I've been a huge fan of the archive since I found out about it soon after it started, and I'm so grateful for its work and excited to be here. So thank you so much.
As I said, and this is genuinely, I'm extremely kind of, happy that we are able to have this conversation. So the way that we are going to do this is, and again, it's, partition impacted families in the American South, which, it's a very unconventional topic of discussion. But you are someone who is unconventional. You come from what wouldn't necessarily be a typical author with a familiar history that one normally reads about. So, and again, what I would like is that first, maybe if you could just share us a little bit about who you are, who you are as a person, and maybe something about your family history.
Absolutely. So I was born and raised in the United States and came of age, as you mentioned, in the American South. My family is mixed race. My father's family is Telugu, and they spent their most recent decades in Hyderabad, but they originally are from Chennai, well, when it was called Madras. And my mother is half Puerto Rican and half Austrian. And was born in the U.S., but was an Army brat. I have a brother. I did not initially come to writing. In fact, I never really felt that writing was something that I was capable of doing. I was raised in the U.S. Well, I was a child in the U.S. in the 70s and the 80s. There was not a lot of representation here of South Asian authors. And most of the authors I read growing up and most of the histories I read about growing up were very Eurocentric, very Caucasian. There were no very few books by Black authors were taught in my schools. Very little was known about Black history. Certainly nothing about South Asian history. I came to know about partition when I was a teenager, and my father made me watch Richard Attenborough's Gandhi. And that was really my first experience with knowing anything about partition. And he also had a copy of Freedom at Midnight by Dominique Lapierre. Obviously, these are stories that were created by white people, so they are not exactly the best lens to learn about partition. However, once introduced to the history, I began after high school and in college, and then after college, trying to just educate myself about history in the world that I was not taught. One significant aspect of that history was partition. I just wanted to learn about it. So while I was a law student, and college student and a law student, I began visiting my local libraries and my local bookstores and just reading about this era. I started with fiction, which was what I had mostly read in my life. That was my preferred genre of books. So I started with some of the well-known books like Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie and Cracking India, which is also called Ice Candy Man when it was originally published by Bapsi Sidhwa. Of course, Train to Pakistan, Khushwant Singh. So I was reading basically all of the classics that I could read. And then once I finished what was available to me, of course, this was in the pre-internet era where literature from the subcontinent was not as easily as accessible. But I started reading nonfiction. And then when I first started using the internet, I was kind of a late user of the internet. I didn't start using it until my mid to late 20s. I began running internet searches about partition and pulling up sort of finally some original sources from the subcontinent, right? Newspaper articles, for example, that were actually written in the 1940s and 50s. And I began looking for firsthand accounts of stories online. And I couldn't find any. I remember being on various sort of early message boards, and the topic wasn't even partition. It would be something else. And somebody would reveal that, their uncles or grandfathers or siblings story about partition, or even their own occasionally. But just little short sentences here and there, not really sort of a full testimony of what people had endured. And I was very curious about this. And of course, the better I became at using the internet, the more accessible these source materials were. And then, and during this time, I spent a lot of time speaking with descendants of partition. These were folks who, for the most part, lived in the diaspora and were not aware and knew that they had relatives who had lived through partition, who had perhaps gone through some very traumatic experiences, but who were never able to share their stories with their offspring, with their nieces and nephews. And so these descendants would talk about the loss of that information, of not knowing about what their parents and grandparents lived through before they passed on, or perhaps knowing some part of the story, but not the full story. And I began thinking a lot about that, because even though my own family lived in the South and did not directly interact with partition, they were witnesses, for example, to the flood of refugees into the area, but did not actually have to become refugees and cross the border.
And sorry, I'm just kind of we and the thing is that we've spoken before as well, but just to kind of have some information for the
Yes.
audience as well, that what is it that in partition, and then for me, I mean, like, again, as someone who's been working on partition related for, like, almost like 30 years, that it draws you in. It becomes like, there is this wonderful phrase that Professor Veena Das, who's going to be our guest at a later stage, she uses, called poisoned knowledge, which
Yes.
is that, once you become infected with this almost kind of this black hole which exists as far as knowledge, because that's what you're saying, that there is something which has existed, and yet there is hardly any information. If there is information, it is provided by people who might have had little to do with, again, what it is that they're trying to do, what it is that they're trying to kind of maybe talk about, and the question of agency is removed. So what is it that pulled you, again, as someone who wasn't directly affected? Yes, you must, and I know that you are going to speak about that, and then you mentioned of your family kind of seeing and the people who were not maybe who were affected by this, but in terms of, the question is then, so what? I mean, one could have been impacted by a lot of other stories. Why partition?
So what drew me to the story was the lack of a comprehensive archive for many decades after partition. The fact that, after, for example, World War II, the Holocaust, the Vietnam War, you could access survivors' stories within a few decades afterwards, for the most part. And the fact that more than 60, close to 70 years passed before there was a very widespread and comprehensive database. That's what my book sort of hinges on. Was this lack of information, was sort of reflective of my own journey, not as someone who read many years about partition long before I thought of writing about it. But there was also the need the ability to sort of connect with a descendant. Though I am not a daughter or granddaughter of partition, I have another side of my family, my Puerto Rican side, that was affected by a tragedy that later sort of estranged me from that side of the family and has essentially cut me off of that heritage. And so the character that the story revolves around is a descendant who is not at all familiar with her ancestral history of partition. She is actually, in the book, she's cut off from her Indian heritage. She is biracial, raised by her mother, had been abandoned by her Indian father. She doesn't understand why. But all of her history, her family history, revolves around how her grandmother Deepa was affected during partition. So it is sort of the lack of history, the inability to form a connection, a full connection with one's identity, that I related to the most, and that got me most interested in writing this novel about partition. The world certainly did not need another partition book. There is a fabulous number of novels, short stories alone, poetry, and certainly a vast library of non-fiction on the subject.
No, but sorry, but I think the world definitely needed your intervention. So, and because again, and this is the thing that your story, it's not the typical almost kind of linear story that one
Sure.
usually had about partition. That there is this start and there is this middle and there is this whatever you want to call it, the conventional conclusion. Your story looks at in the multiple angles, multiple individuals, multiple events taking place. So how were you? And again, what was the reason for that? Why make your life
Yes.
difficult? It made it very interesting for the readers, but why would you take something which was maybe rather unconventional way of writing about partition?
So colonization, partition, these are world histories. And I wanted to show that this isn't just a history of the subcontinent, right? We can't just isolate something like, for example, the Vietnam War and pretend that nothing else is affected by that history, right? Same with partition. This is world history. And so the consequences of partition affect people. The book takes place in London in the 1950s, right? It takes place in Amsterdam in later decades. It takes place in both India and Pakistan then, but also in the present day. It takes place in the United States. So multiple people are impacted by world history, by these incredibly difficult chapters in history, right? When 1 to 2 million people perish, when 15 million people are refugees, it's not in isolation, right? There are reverberations that happen around the world and change and affect people's lives. And so I wanted to take sort of a bird's eye view of partition. So the book, roughly one third of it takes place during partition, but actually roughly 2/3 of it take place in the decades, in the 7 decades that follow after partition, because events in history, they live on, and they live on in different nations, and they live on through different people. And I wanted sort of that perspective on events in history.
So the other thing is in terms of, again, Americans, the way that one kind of views America or the US, that these are people who are insular. Okay, so now here is someone who who is trying to, as exactly, and that's the fascinating point, that one cannot, no matter how strong or economically powerful a country is, that you cannot live in isolation. There are all these different strands which are connecting people who are part of your collective ethos. So I think, like, for me, then that was something which kind of keeps drawing me into the characters which are created. But again, because you are so kind of multidimensional, so I wanted to ask, why move from being an attorney into, like, something which is rather, I don't know, risky or unconventional? Why, and was writing the reason you left being an attorney? And then if you could talk a little bit more about, as an organizer, what does that entail, and how is that connected to partition, if it is?
Oh, I think it absolutely is. I've been engaged in social change work since I was a teenager. Social change work, activism, grassroots coalition building around a cause. That's something that I've always done. It led me to law school first, where I did I worked for a federal agency that investigated unfair labor practices. But it felt more natural to me, especially as I began reading more South Asian literature and becoming aware of more South Asian authors in the United States, that writing was a possibility. And so when I began writing, I at first I was doing essays and articles about parenting, then moved to book reviews. But it became clear to me that I had very real criticisms of journalism as an industry and how mainstream media portrays the plight of people. Right? We have a lot of sort of tools of journalism which tell us, for example, you should know both sides of every story. But in reality, both sides is sort of a false prophecy, right? The notion of objectivity in journalism. I was really trying to challenge how stories were told about oppressed communities and about oppressed people. And I mean, it's very related to the work that the archive does every day, right? I mean,
That
people.
is supposed to be my follow-up question. But this is exactly the point, that you work in grassroots, and that's where your interest was. And you talk about this organization in your book as well. And that's one of the things that 1947 Partition Archive does. So did this organization, did it help in terms of in the quest that you were kind of on, to almost kind of find individual narratives which were a kind of strands which were not necessarily part of the grand narrative, that which others were able to tell you with certain amount of confidence, but but there was something lacking. So what role did, if any, 1947 Partition Archive played in the parted earth?
So, a couple ways to answer that question. So, for the first part of it, the last 5 or 6 years or so, I have been a voting rights advocate and election organizer in the South Asian community. Right, I get out the vote in the community, which means explaining to politicians, right, candidates and elected officials, that we exist here, right? We're in the stark minority still here in the United States. And a lot of the voting rights laws today have targeted our communities, meaning they are eliminating the ways that we choose to vote in the South Asian community, which is oftentimes early or absentee ballot, especially in the state of Georgia where I live. But secondly, there is a real sort of similarity, right? There's a parallel between the work of making South Asians visible in the United States and making their voting stories heard by people in power, to what the archive does, right? Which is making visible the stories, the real, actual, and lived stories of folks that witnessed and lived through this event. So in that
And it's a
sense,
question of agency, and it's a question of
absolutely.
agency, which is, what trauma or what violence does is suppress agency. And in terms of the characters which are there, that they are somehow, through their narrative, they're able to capture, or at least hold on to that particular agency.
100%. If people feel traumatized, they do not share their stories, right? They feel that the trauma deprives them of agency, and then perhaps that's why they don't share their stories. If people do not have agency, they don't go to the polls to vote because they feel like that their vote and their voice in government isn't valuable and won't change things. It's really two sides of the same coin. For example, I mean, when we were starting to get out the vote in the South Asian community. The South Asian community here had been completely ignored. Nobody cared if we went to the polls. And we, when I would talk to voters, you know, I would knock doors, right? Knocking on the door and saying, "Hey, how are you? This is what, you know, the election coming up is." They would tell me, you know, I'm not political, which often translated to, I've been ignored in the United States political process. Why would I invest my time in it? Which is a very valid concern. I mean, you know, barriers to voting are often systemic, right? Barriers to telling stories from the partition are systemic, right? There wasn't even an organization for so long. But then people, you know, it's the stories that become history, right, are the people in power, right? The people who are wealthy. And archive shakes that up, right? It makes storytelling something that's more equitable, as does journalism when it's done well, as does a grassroots community activism, right? All of these tools and resources we have sort of upend the tradition of letting a certain highly privileged segment of the population determine one's fate, right? Write one's story.
And again, for those of you who've joined us now, you're watching Sunday Stories live from the 1947 Partition Archive. Anjali Enjeti is our guest, and my name is Furrukh Khan. We have maybe one or two. I have number of questions. Again, I can talk all day about partition, but what we will do is that we will soon open up our discussion for our with our audience. So, if you have any comments or questions for Anjali, please do share them on our chat board, and then we'll try to answer however many that we can. And the thing is, because I had, rightly introduced you as someone who's multidimensional. So you talked about your as an author, as an organizer, as a former attorney. But one more part, which is something, at least in this particular season that we are trying to do, which is about teaching, about dissemination. So it's fantastic that one is able to create knowledge, but how is that disseminated? So, and again, I know that you work on these different topics, on these issues. Does partition or the impact of partition or the latent memory or the internalized trauma of partition, does that ever come up, sitting in Atlanta teaching at Reinhardt University? Are these things ever connected?
I think so. I teach graduate students in creative writing at my university, and the idea of storytelling and what it is has evolved substantially since I was a graduate student. It's evolved even more since I was in high school and learning how to read and interpret and write literature. I think what's happened is we've realized that there are ways to both empower and disempower people who have stories to share, and that in fact, for the longest time, there was so much gatekeeping to stories, to telling only certain kinds of stories. And so, as a teacher, what I really appreciate is that we are sort of upending that model, and we are showing students, or at least I certainly hope I do this as an instructor, that their stories are powerful as they are, and their truths are important. And in fact, there are lessons to learn from their truths, right? I mean, we need to be, it's not as if archives self-select and decide whose story is more important than the other, right? For the longest time in creative teaching, in the pedagogy, right? It was really about trying to conform to primarily white male stories, right? And most of my students are not white and male. In fact, they are multiply marginalized, and they have sort of been told their whole lives that that their words don't matter. And so I think the lesson from the archive is that we need to find ways of making sure that people tell their stories. And in fact, the most marginalized folks are the ones that should be writing history. That they should be the ones whose stories are centered,
mm,
and who we should learn from the most.
mm,
And that is true in both the work of archives, and it should be true in the work of creative writing teaching. We're not really there yet,
mm,
but I think a number of people who teach creative writing are really starting to challenge notions of how it's been traditionally taught.
mm,
We used to have syllabi when I was growing up. We used to have syllabi where every single author I had to read was a white male author. What are they writing about? They're writing about, say, the American South only from their perspective. They're
mm,
writing about wars, right? Of people who fly into other brown and black countries and kill people, and then that's the happy ending, right? They're writing about colonization. They're from the colonizer's perspective, right? And so I hope we are in this new era of both journalism and creating and creative writing and archives, where we are really starting to
mm.
dismantle that model.
100% agree. And I think like the resistance or the fight back does not begin till one acknowledges and one articulates what it is that has happened. And I think like one of the things that 1947 the Partition Archive does is that people who might think of themselves as ordinary, but the thing is, they are the ones who almost kind of are a testament to an extraordinary time.
Hmm.
So the stories, which otherwise there are others who are ready to appropriate them, but the thing is that this is a question of them assuming agency or some semblance of control what it is that's happened to them. So again, for those of you who are watching, and this is Sunday Stories Live from 1947 Partition Archive. It is my pleasure and honor to have Anjali Enjeti as our guest. My name is Furrukh Khan. We are coming up to the point where we would love to have your feedback. So if you have questions or comments, please do share them with us, and we will try to have Anjali respond to. So you have greetings, SN Sheikh, greetings from New York City. So thank you from Ludhiana to Karachi. Wow. Okay. So again, thanks for sharing this. It is, and I said like no, I'm fascinated. Anjali, do you get to go to India? I mean, like, have you visited Partition? And again, are those visitations to the Telugu ancestry, or now that, in a sense, that since you work on Partition, is that something which one tries to kind of unearth or at least connect to uh, when and if you have visited India?
So I visited India often growing up. My grandparents were based in Hyderabad, but I also had a lot of family members in Delhi. And Unfortunately, I was one of many first cousins that were all roughly the same age. Unfortunately, all of my cousins left India when they went to college in the United States, but then they all left for jobs or graduate school. So I only have a single aunt and uncle who live in Mysore, but all of my other relatives are in Australia and Singapore and Amsterdam and the United States. And I went back several years ago to a cousin's wedding, but unfortunately, I went as kind of a tourist, which was the first time for me where we were staying in hotels because
Hmm.
there just wasn't family to stay there anymore. I had been planning on going to India the year of in 2020 when the pandemic started. Unfortunately, I was not able to do that. and I had planned to go to Delhi, which is one of my favorite cities in India, and where I had gone many times when I was a child and a young adult. So that didn't happen. I'm hoping to go to India in 2023. To go back not only to where my family is originally from, but I'm hoping to make it a longer trip and to hit a whole bunch of cities, including those I've
You
never.
should visit Lahore as well. So,
I would love to. I would love to
yeah.
visit Lahore. I've never been to Mumbai, I'm looking forward to another trip. I'm trying to go before my father gets too elderly, because I want to
Yeah.
take him back. He's wanted to go back. But sadly, we just do not have the number of family members living there
Mm,
anymore.
mm,
So it feels a little bit like losing our own personal family history, given that so many members are in the diaspora now,
mm.
sadly.
Okay, we have a question from Ram Narayan Paragi. Anjali, how did the South Asian community blend with local cultures? Like in New Orleans, they were neither seen as white nor blacks, but sorry, but were still able to acclimatize with Creoles, Cajuns, etc.
This is such a great question, and I should say at the outset that I've never lived in New Orleans, so I can't really answer that question specific to New Orleans, but I think I can answer it more generally in the United States. South Asians here have a long history of activism and in working in concert and in community with the Black community. We know this is true from Kamala Harris, our vice president's mother, who, in fact, though Indian, she aligned herself with the Black community, and she did community organizing work with Black folks, and raised her two daughters to have a very strong Black identity. Unfortunately, though, we have too many South Asians here in the United States who align themselves with white supremacy, who see success as being as much like white people as possible. And so we have a lot of work to do to understand that to break what is known as the model minority myth here, which means that we want to be known only for our successes in the eyes of white folks and to be accepted by that community. As we know, assimilation is very oftentimes means assimilating with white supremacy
Yeah.
and white systems of power. And so we have a lot of activism in our communities here that is trying to disrupt that notion, where South Asian activists and community members are aligning themselves with Black folks and other Asian groups and Latin groups, and understanding that there really is no winning if we are making whiteness the goal, right?
Mm,
And it's been a struggle. I will be honest; it's been a struggle here. We have too many folks who think that acceptance and success is based on what white people think. And thankfully, the resistors in the community are getting louder and organizing more and saying, look, if we do not lift up the most marginalized folks and do not align ourselves and ally ourselves with them, we are all going to lose eventually.
mm.
So we have a lot of disruption going on, and it's been a beautiful thing to see.
Okay. I was going to ask another question, but of course, the audience gets preference. I had my chance. So here is Sunita Mukherjee, and her question is: can you comment on the sense of belongingness, a communitarian sensibility amongst the partition impacted families migrating to the American South Bend? And I can, if I could just add a question which was in my mind, is similar to this, because on and it's something that you know and you kind of touch upon that trauma, you might suppress it, but it doesn't really stay suppressed. It is internalized and it manifests itself in different ways and forms. And I wanted to ask people who were impacted by partition and who might have moved to different parts of the world, and in this case, in the southern part of the US. How is their recollection of partition maybe different, or do they have the same biases, or because of the stories, the meta narratives that they have heard, or the family histories that they have? So I know this is like slightly different from this particular question, but I was hoping that if you could address the other one as well. But Sunita's question, I don't know whether you still remember, because I keep talking.
They're both great questions, and I think they're very interrelated questions. So I will do my absolute best to answer them both. I will tell you at the outset that of the people that I know and that I've spoken with, one's individual sense of what justice is and what justice means colors what they think of their ancestral history of partition and how it's related to the present day, right? As I've sort of mentioned, right, whether you were in the American South, whether you were in other parts of the United States or other parts in the world in the diaspora, how you think of history and what you think of history is often influenced by your notions of justice and your notions of identity and community. And so people are on different sides of it. I have some friends who's are descendants of partition who have a really solid sense of justice and partition and that history of it in their family has turned them into democratic activists who are fighting for rights, fighting for members of the communities who are most oppressed, fighting for justice, who are the first people who talk about things like discrimination against minorities, particularly Muslims, particularly undocumented immigrants, anti-Black racism here in the US. And then you have some descendants of partition who have unfortunately gone the other way, who believe that India should be a country only for Hindus, who agree with the CAA, who believe that Kashmir should belong to India, who see, who support Trump and who support Modi. I would say, and I think this is true of all chapters of history, actually. One sense of justice often colors how you think of the past, right? If you feel that your community and your identity should be advanced, you should have interests above other people. If you feel entitled to more rights than others, then obviously you see partition in a different way, right? But if you feel that in this world we should all be in coalition with one another, if you prioritize civil and human rights, right? If you see the sort of analogies to colonization in India to what white people did during slavery, right? If you see those as sort of two sides of the different coin, and you see civil and human rights as something that everyone in the world should have and should be entitled to, then your sense of what happened during partition is different than if you believe that you have an individual self-worth and you have the ability to pull yourself up and your family up, and therefore who the heck cares about everybody else. Then you also think about history in a different way. So, I think, as an activist and as a writer, the goal is to sort of make people aware that, look, events in history are all connected, right? Partition didn't just happen in India, right? It happened in Korea as well. It happens in, we have Israel and Palestine. I mean, we have other partitions. The sort of ideologies that precede what happens are often very similar, right? So if we connect these up to what's happening today in the present days in our world today, and who we are as people. And that if we work, for example, for the rights of people in India, we should also be working for the rights of people in the US, and we should also be working for the rights of people in the Middle East who are oppressed. Then we understand that we are all one story, right? Which is not to erase the individual experiences of communities and identities. I just mean we should also see the bigger picture and see that the same oppressive forces that affect one set of people are actually also affecting other sets of people.
And again, you talk about viewing history in a different way, and one of course, the states viewed in a different way, and we were talking about the colonialists, them writing about history would have been, and European would have been. My question is almost kind of much more at a fundamental level, that even as men and women view, or okay, now let me pose this question: that did you see that one could generalize the way maybe men viewed history in terms of the research that you had carried out for this book, and the way that women view history? And again, that is, be it in the grand scheme, on the grand scale, or even at a personal level.
So that's another great question. Boy, you have so many of them, Professor. So, the word history is literally his story, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So, women and other minoritized gender groups, right? Because there are not just two. Um, People who are not men have always controlled what history is, always being obviously general. We have women who have over centuries tried, documented history, but it's either destroyed, ignored, erased, silenced, right? They didn't have the institutional power to make their documentation of what was happening around them widely available, right? Because women were always, journals, letter writing. They were, when they weren't allowed to go to school, they were still researching and writing what they were seeing, right? It's not that women didn't write history; it's that history was suppressed, and only the perspective of men was seen as primary source. Men are seen as having the authority, right? And so their voices are loudest and tend to drown out the other voices that are trying to speak. And so I think we have a lot of work to do, because, most historians, for example, who get the book contracts with the larger presses and the most money, who get the TV appearances, right? Who are interviewed in newspapers, are still men, right? When we think of major historians, we still unfortunately, think of men. And so, we have a long way to go when it comes to understanding that women's perspectives are very much left out of the narrative, and that we need to both restore this and ensure that young historians, who are women, are getting the sort of institutional support they need so that they can tell the stories that they want to tell. Urvashi Butalia wrote The Other Side of Silence, right? I mean, she wrote this groundbreaking book that talked about that, where she had stories in there about women, especially the women during partition that experienced sexual violence. And we have, but they're not given the institutional support that they deserve. And the men still get that. So I think we have a lot. I mean, I'd be curious about your own perspective as someone that teaches partition, right? Surely you also see this imbalance.
Absolutely. I mean, of course, and that's the whole thing. The patriarchy, the male gaze is on the physical side, the violence, and, the mere description, oh, this is how terrible these things were inflicted, but much more on the physical side. But in number of cases, and again, people like Urvashi Butalia, you have done this, and Kamala Basin, number of them, Ritu Menon, Vinodas's work on this, is the in a sense, the true madness that takes place in your mind when you're not really able to comprehend the suddenness with which the world upturns.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so I think like for men, and again, of course, it is a kind of a generalization, that the complexities, the nuances are somehow ignored. And because women's stories focus on that particular part, it doesn't really jive in with the simplistic grand narrative then that man. So this is something, again, I mean, I'm don't consider myself an expert, but someone who's been delving in this particular topic for a long while, that it's something which has come up, and women have had to negotiate a place for them where they were survivors of
Mm-hmm.
partition, but now they become victims of the patriarchal and the familial structure. So the struggle is real. The struggle is present,
Mm-hmm.
and the struggle is just to kind of cope with what it is that they've been part of. So yeah, I mean, like,
100%.
it's a,
I mean, the reason why the parted earth is almost like the book is women. It's all women, right? The men are kind of the backseat of the book. The reason I wanted to focus on the women is because women have, no matter what culture you come from, women are the keepers of ancestral histories. They are the
absolutely.
ones who make sure that heirlooms and stories are passed down from one generation to another. So, but they don't get credit for that, right? More often than not, they don't get credit. They are the oral storytellers, right? Oh, this is what happened to your grandparents. This is what they lived through. They are the ones who make sure that their ancestral stories get told in the family languages. They're the ones who give a piece of jewelry or a journal, or make sure that their descendants know this is where you came from and this is important. That job is usually done by the women. And so,
Absolutely.
I wanted to focus the novel on women because this is often not sort of ignored, right? But it is the women who pass down most of these stories, and they don't get that kind of credit that they are actually they are the head of the archives of their families, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
we can talk
Absolutely.
about a formal archive like the 1947 Partition archive, but when we talk about our family archivists, they are more often than not the grandmothers and the mothers and the aunts and the sisters than they are the men, right? They are the ones keeping the trunk in the room that have, a piece of clothing or photographs, right? They're the ones preserving the photographs and the family letters. It's the women. So I wanted to make sure that they were the center to piecing together the mysteries of my novel, because they are often the ones that are preserving the family histories.
And talking about the novel, we are approaching the last, almost kind of, I'm looking at the clock, 7 minutes. So I was wondering if you could read something from your novel for our audience, and I'd love to hear the passage that you might have chosen.
I would be happy to. So before I read this brief excerpt, I'll give a setup about the book. As we've talked about, the book takes place over 70 years, and it's three generations of people. It's primarily told through 2 points of view. One is a child, a 16-year-old child named Deepa, who lives in New Delhi in 1947. And the second character is Shanti Johnson, who is in the present day in her 40s, living in Atlanta, Georgia. She is going through a divorce. She's just had a pregnancy loss. But Shanti, who goes by Sean, is estranged from Deepa. And it has to do with the tragedy that befell Deepa during partition. The scene I'm going to read through the book is the only one where we see Sean as a child. She is 10 years old and visiting her father, Vijay, for the first time in New Delhi. Vijay was living in the United States with her, abandoned the family when Sean was 5, and moved to New Delhi, and wasn't very clear about why he did that. And that reason is also related to partition and his need to find the father who he's never met. Um, So in this scene, Vijay takes his daughter to the Taj Mahal in an attempt to sort of win her over. She is not very impressed with him. She's a little angry at him for leaving the family and for not understanding how much she's hurt by it. But Sean doesn't know, especially at age 10. She has no idea about the tragedies that have befallen her family and that her estrangement is very much related to partition. So this is a scene with them at the Taj Mahal with Sean, who is 10 years old. "I've really missed you, Shanti," her father said. She hadn't heard her birth name in a long time. Even on the plane ride over, during their one-night stopover in London, their connection to Delhi, he'd addressed her by her nickname, Sean. She'd adopted it at the beginning of the first grade, not long after he left them. She wanted something easier to pronounce, something that other kids wouldn't make fun of that sounded more in tune with her last name, her mother's name, Johnson. Sean could be short for Shauna. No one needed to know the truth. But she liked how he said Shanti right now, how it rolled off his tongue, how the TH sound became something harder, sharper, something so different than the way her mother used to say it. "Let me show you something," he said. He led her around the corner, pivoted her body, directed her gaze along the banks of a shallow river. "See there? It's called Agra Fort. In the distance, red cylindrical towers kissed low-lying clouds. Walls like decorative curtains strung them together. That's the palace where Emperor Shah Jahan ruled India," he said. "When Mumtaz died, he built the Taj Mahal here so he could watch over her from Agra Fort. When he died, they entombed him here with her." He paused. Isn't that a lovely thought? He never wanted to be apart from his wife. The truth of his statement stung. The emperor had never wanted to be away from the queen, but her own father had gone as far away from her and her mother as he could. "I never knew my father," he said, his gaze locked on hers. "Did I ever tell you that?" The words fell out of his mouth, landed with a thud between them. His father would be her grandfather. She knew this, though how she came to know it escaped her. She always seemed to know about this absence in her father's life, much the same way she always knew of her own father's absence in hers. "I've no idea what he even looks like," he continued. "I think about him every day, though." "Why don't you try to find him?" she asked. "I can't. The only information I have of his name." He leaned over the railing, dropped his head to his chest. "He had a younger sister, too. All I know is her name. Your grandmother refuses to tell me more." Sean had just met her grandmother for the first time on their way to India. They had a 24-hour layover in London and stayed overnight in her drafty apartment a few streets over from Big Ben. She was rail thin with stark black hair. Her forehead wrinkled like an accordion when she raised her eyebrows. A lit cigarette dangled from her fingers. She had held it like some kind of stylish accessory to her outfit. Her grandmother had hugged Sean awkwardly, as if she hadn't quite known where to place her hands, patted her head a little too firmly. The next day, when she and her father headed out to catch the second leg of their flight to Delhi, their goodbyes had been just as awkward as their greetings. Sean couldn't imagine what it was like for her father to have such a cold mother, to never know his own father. Her father had seemed oblivious to the fact that they shared this kind of sadness of missing fathers. She wanted to shake him in that moment. His decision to move to India without her had been a selfish one. He still did not see it as such. 5 years into his relocation, was wholly unaware of how his absence continued to hurt her, how it made her feel so lonely. For her 8th birthday, he had mailed her a globe, the earth parted by latitudes and longitudes, oceans and continents. She had measured with her hands the distance between Seattle and India. 9 hands. The sun never shone on them at the same time. He had moved so far away from her, he might as well have moved to the moon. When he lifted his face, his gaze traced the horizon and settled back on Agra Fort. "Nothing makes me happier than having you here with me now," he said. "No one has ever meant more to me than you." She smiled, her first of the day. If these rare moments were all they could ever have together, maybe it would be enough. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Well, I'm kind of just absolutely fascinated, the hour has passed so very quickly. Thank you so much, Anjali. I really enjoyed our interaction, and thank you so much for taking the. Tarun has uh, Tarun said is a friend, and he's put a question, but I don't know. I think we can't really. We're running out of time, but maybe I can share this with Anjali, and she can respond to it offline. So once again, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for tuning in, and if you enjoy and like the work that 1947 Partition Archive is doing, please consider making a donation of any size. We rely 100% on donations as an NGO. In some countries, donations are tax-free. Links are described of this in the video, and you can get information on our website. So once again, thank you very much, and
Thank
it's
you.
me, saying, please take care of yourself. Assalamu alaikum, good evening, namaste, and sat sri akal from Lahore till we meet each other again. Okay, bye bye.